Big thanks to the Holocaust Museum LA. It's so nice to work on this event with you. It's always such a pleasure to be back in LA. Before we begin, I want to introduce Michael and Debbie. Well, actually, Michael will be talking to you about his life and his story during our conversation. But Michael is a great friend, an amazing father, grandfather, Auschwitz survivor, educator, and so much more. You'll hear about his story today. And Debbie Holinstat, I got to meet Debbie through my work with Michael. Debbie is a veteran TV producer and writer. She spent 22 years writing about politics for TV. She's a recipient of the Edward Murrow Award for live breaking news. And she always says that the greatest honor and privilege of her life and the greatest reward has been working with her father. They co-wrote a book called Survivors Club that we have here. They will talk about this process a little bit today. So they're an amazing team, and it's so nice to. We've done a lot of events with Michael. I've never had an honor to have one of those events with Debbie. So thank you so much, both of you, for coming from New York. Before I ask my first question, I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I met Michael and how this book came to be. And to do that, I want us to step back to the pre-COVID world, January 2020. It actually, looking back at it now, it almost seems impossible that we managed to get 120 Auschwitz-Birkenau survivors from all over the world, from the United States, Canada, Australia, Israel, Sweden, even South America, get them on planes. And our foundation, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Foundation, organized this delegation. We asked them to go back to Auschwitz, which was difficult for many of them, and as you will hear in a moment. For many of them, it was the first time they went back since the war. For many of them, it was the last time they went, because unfortunately, over the course of COVID and the past few years, we lost many of the survivors who came with us to Auschwitz in 2020. But right before the lockdown, right before the pandemic, we all showed up. We went to Krakow, we went to Auschwitz together, and as a result of that trip, we became like family. We became friends. We already knew each other before the trip to Poland, but I think our relationship got much deeper, and we developed trust. And I think anybody who works in the field of memory and memory preservation knows that trust is critical. So when we came back and we were stranded home during the lockdown, we all cooked, right? So. We thought, okay, this trip was incredible. We had such ambitious plans to travel with survivors, to have all these reunions, and then we kind of faced this like an existential crisis, as all the organizations did and everybody personally did. What now? So we pivoted and we all moved to Zoom, of course. So we started having monthly Zoom calls with survivors just to keep them company. It honestly came from an earnest desire to stay connected. And we saw in Krakow and in Auschwitz how happy they were to be connected to one another. So we continued this tradition. And it was Passover 2020. We had one of those Zoom calls. And we were kind of running out of topics. And we just asked a silly question, what are you cooking? What are you cooking? And our chairman, Ronald Lauder, asked a question, okay, so how do you make your gefilte fish? Because my grandma used to make it this way. And survivors really responded to this question. And as a result, I received 20 gefilte fish recipes. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of gefilte fish. And I jokingly said we should have a gefilte fish cookbook. But we thought, okay, nobody would buy that. But I said, okay, but I think we're onto something. Because when you work in the field of Holocaust education, you realize that a lot of questions you ask of survivors become very formulaic. Same questions. And then talking about food and aroma and those core memories opened survivors up to new stories. I got to know them in a new way, and that's how this book came to be. So this is the story. So I want to move to the first question. And this is a question to you, Michael. You're one of the youngest Auschwitz survivors. You were 4 when the Auschwitz-Birkenau was liberated. You grew up in Żarki, Poland, not far away actually from Auschwitz, north of Oświęcim, the town where Auschwitz is. Your father and brother were killed. Your mother survived, reunited with you after Auschwitz, and you both immigrated to the United States. And I know that the World War II experience haunted you for many years, for many decades after the war. You had dreams of the shoutings, of the beatings, the smell of the burnt flesh. All of these memories were very vivid in your memory. You got to the point where you were considering removing your tattoo and changing your name. And you never spoke about your war experience. So I wanted to ask you what changed your mind and why you made a decision to start talking about it.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay? Great. Well, there are a few reasons. I didn't talk about my experience in Auschwitz, but I have a grandson who was doing a mitzvah. I don't know if any of you know what a mitzvah is. They were doing a charity he was doing a charity project at his synagogue, and he asked me if I would talk about Auschwitz and so on. And I just can't say no to my grandkids. So that was...
He had said no to me, by the way, for about 30 years at that point, and 35 years. But yeah, one grandson asked, and he's like, what do you want to know?
The other thing that happened, maybe you can talk about this, is the Deniers Club. Can you talk about that, Deb?
Yeah, so Jake takes full credit, my nephew, for, sort of opening the faucet for my dad, like turning that on. But, and I had been pushing for many years for my dad, like, can you sit down and talk to me? I would like to write your story. And so he started talking a little bit more seriously about it. And so my dad and I were sitting down one day, and we Googled Children Liberation Auschwitz, because we knew at this point in the 1980s, my dad had first spotted some of that famous footage of him. You saw the picture on the front of the book of him at Liberation, right? And so we knew it existed. So we Googled it. And if you put, if you do that, you will find a million thumbnails that come up that look like that book cover image. And we picked the wrong one to click on. We clicked on one, said, you want to visit the site? Said yes. It took us to the Cadeau Revisionist Forum. It's a Holocaust deniers website. And it captioned the video that I'll show you in a second. This shows the lies Jews have been telling that children were killed on arrival at Auschwitz. And so that was kind of fuel for my dad. He figured if the deniers are talking, he needed to talk louder.
Und Dr. Mengel suchten sich unter ihnen eine bestimmte Kategorie aus. Alle, die Sie hier als Überlebende sehen, sind Zwillinge.
A little boy on the bottom right.
Sie wissen nicht, wie sie heißen. Sie kennen ihre Familie nicht. Nur...
So, you've probably seen tattoos before, but it reads B1148, and trust me, it doesn't wash off. So, Debbie, you have a charm.
Yeah, actually, I just had this made.
About that?
Yeah, it has B1148 on it too. My siblings and I all had these made recently, so that our hope is that people will notice them and will ask, "What is that?" And it'll give us an opportunity to tell, the story. My dad. This was another picture, by the way, from the Cadeau Revisionist Forum. This is my dad's grandmother Dora carrying him there. The deniers captioned this one, "Pretty healthy children for a quote death camp," implying, that Auschwitz wasn't so bad. My dad's mom, by the way, wasn't there because she had been moved to an Austrian labor camp. She left my dad. She had no choice. She left my dad behind in Auschwitz, expecting, that she was saying goodbye forever, that she would never see him again in this lifetime. And she survived the Austrian labor camp, and she found him in Zarki after the war, and honestly never, got over the fact that my dad had lived. Yeah.
I'm so happy we have this photo up here of Sophie. I want to ask you about your mother's recipe that you shared with me for the cookbook. So, when I interviewed you for the book, when we talked about it, we discussed the fact that Nazis tried to eradicate Jewish culture, music, literature, etc., and also food. And when we were working on this book, we talked a lot about the importance of tradition and memory, and we started having conversations about food and how to pass the tradition over to your children, grandchildren. Why did you pick the sweet kugel recipe? By the way, I remember testing this recipe for the first time. It's
Very low in calories.
yeah,
It's so healthy. It's so
Yeah.
healthy.
I had to run a half marathon after I had it. Yeah. So it's an interesting recipe because it's a recipe that you didn't have. Your family recreated it from memory, and it took you a while to recreate it. But I want you to talk a little bit about that recipe and the importance of food to the process of remembrance.
Well, the Nazis tried to eradicate all remnants of Jewish people. So they killed over 1 million people in Auschwitz. Over 6 million people were killed in Europe because of Hitler. But the importance to us is not necessarily the religion, but the tradition that we have with food and other things that we go to a synagogue maybe twice a year, so we're not Orthodox Jewish people, but the tradition is extremely important. So the noodle kugel, we didn't have the recipe, but my kids, my wife recreated it, and we love to have it whenever we have Thanksgiving, we have Passover.
Just like the Pilgrims did, right? Noodle kugel.
So that is one of the things. There are numerous other traditions, but again, that is the important thing that we have, is remembering food is one. And so Maria was wonderful in organizing and recreating the book Honeycakes and Latkes. And so the noodle kugel is in there, and we absolutely love it. There are many, many other recipes that are great, and I'm sure if you buy the book, you'll find many that you absolutely love.
So I want to ask you, Debbie, when we first came up with the idea of this cookbook of recipes by Auschwitz-Birkenau survivors, many people said it sounded like a bad joke, like putting the idea of comfort and food and the Holocaust in one sentence. And we struggled a little bit with that, and actually this seeming the contradiction is addressed in the opening paragraphs of the foreword to the book by our chairman. He actually calls this book the triumph of the human spirit. But I wanted to ask you, Debbie, when we think about food, we also think about hunger. When we think about survival, we think about death, and those things go hand in hand. And I wanted to ask you about the trauma of being the daughter of a survivor, and what was it like to be raised by a survivor. And I know from many conversations I've had with children of survivors that there is a particular relationship to food and cooking. So I was wondering if you would tell us a little bit about that.
So if you had asked me probably before I wrote Survivors Club, like, did you suffer trauma as the daughter of a survivor? I would have said no. And the truth is, I mean, my life's pretty great. My dad and mom did an amazing job creating this positive, optimistic, beautiful world for me and my siblings to grow up in, and that's all very true. But what I've realized now, after spending so much time talking to my dad and to other survivors, is like there's little things that that you don't even realize are kind of there. You know, we used to joke about the fact that, you know, as soon as you finish your meal and you're full, quick put your napkin over it, or, you know, quick hide it, or, you know, put it down the drain quickly, because my dad could never leave anything. He could never waste, you know, even though we could have afforded a meal for all 4 siblings when we went on vacation, we all split them, because God forbid anybody should leave a scrap of food, right? And so it was a joke, you know, oh, Dad's going to take your food. But the truth is, I've realized lately how much I have become my father, in that when I go to people's houses, and we have one cousin in particular, and she's so decadent, and she always has, you know, the most beautiful cheeses I've ever seen, and, you know, spreads out charcuterie boards. And at the end of the night, I see her dump them in the trash. You know, I'm like, what are you doing? And it truly upsets me. It truly, like, really upsets me, because, like, I think, like, what would my dad, you would have a heart attack, Dad. Like, what would my dad think if he saw this? And just in other ways, too, like, we were doing construction on our house, and someone came to pull the oven out and put a new oven in, and I realized when they took the oven out that behind the oven, there's actually a huge hole under there, and goes under the staircase of my hallway. And I was like, that's where we'll go. That's where we'll hide, you know? And, like, I actually thought that I should tell my contractor, who we adore, like, if anything ever happens, like, you move in here and this is our hiding place. The fact that even crossed my mind, I was like, I guess I'm probably more affected, you know, than I realized. But I have to end that answer by just saying my dad has done, like, an unbelievable job of making sure that my siblings and I only saw goodness, you know, around us, and, like, really created a really great world for us. Dad, you did. So
There, Michael, there is the photo that we showed in the beginning from the cookbook features you holding up an object that means so much to you. I wanted you to tell us a little bit about it, and I know it's a treasured object, and I'm so glad you brought it with you from New Jersey. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. This is a Kiddush cup. During the war, the Nazis came into Jewish homes, and 1 week they took all the furs, leather goods, money, whatever. So basically, Jewish people made a makeshift vault in the back of their house, and my parents did the same. They put money and pearls and valuables in the back. And so when the war was over, some of the Polish people occupied the house, and they wouldn't let my family in there. So when my grandmother came back to Żarki, we couldn't get back into our house. So she found a farm with a chicken coop with a board over her head. Again, this is the dead of winter. And this is how we lived. My mother had been sent from Auschwitz to Austria to pack bullets. So my mother came back and found us this way. But anyway, my mother went back to the house in the dead of night and trying to find the treasures that they buried. And the only thing that was left was this Kiddush cup. And so this Kiddush cup has been used for our wedding, our children's weddings, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs. And so it really, really means a lot to us. And so that's where the importance of the Kiddush cup. Do you want me to talk about the watch too, Maria? Or? Okay, not right now. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
I think this is a perfect moment, Debbie, to ask you a little bit more about the process of working on Survivors Club, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the family's history.
So like I said, I did want to tell my dad's story for a very, very long time. He said no till Jake, he was like, till he didn't. And so then, I said to my dad, we really need something in writing for your grandkids like this. And the plan was to write a book that I had a whole deal worked out with a self-publishing company. I was going to, pay to publish it myself and just keep it in a drawer for the grandkids. And then it's a long, convoluted, crazy banana story how it ended up being published by Macmillan and on the New York Times bestseller list. And that was crazy. But anyway, I will tell you the journey was, I wanted it accessible to the grandkids. And so I used my son, who at the time was 10, to keep sort of previewing chapters for me. And what I really wanted my kids and my nieces and nephews to understand was how lucky they are, and how much they should cherish Judaism, how proud they should be. I mean, people died. 6 million people died because they were Jewish. How proud they should be to stand here as Jewish, people, little humans, and how lucky they should feel, because not only did my dad survive, there's a reason the book is called Survivors Club. My grandma Sophie, my dad's mom, had 6 brothers and sisters before the war. So 7 siblings, all really tight-knit family, but they all made different decisions about where to go. So one of the sisters was in the Warsaw Ghetto, Majdanek, Skarżuszko, Buchenwald, and was led on a death march out of Buchenwald. Another sister was in Warsaw, trekked across Siberia, first went to Vilno, then Siberia, was saved by Chuni Sugihara, a Japanese statesman, and made it all the way to Japan. Some of the brothers went into hiding in various attics and bunkers around town, and hoping that they wouldn't be caught there. And the unbelievable thing is, all 7 siblings survived.
They all survived.
In a town that had about 3,600 Jews before the war, only 27 were known to come home, and it was mostly our family. And that's my grandma Sophie up there on the top right after the war, Aunt Hilda, the littlest sister, in the middle, looking amazing. She was always amazing. She was in all those camps. And on the death march, next up the top is Sam and Sesha, my Grandma Sophie's brother and sister-in-law, and their little girl Ruth, who also survived. My dad's first cousin, they were just a couple months apart, and so that was amazing. But the book writing journey itself, I wanted to just mention that it led to some incredible connections as well that we didn't see coming. This part I knew a lot of how this story went before we even started writing it, because I knew so much from the family. But right after Survivors Club was published, my dad did some TV news interviews. And we'd set up a book website, and this woman reaches out, and she writes to my dad, "I'm the little girl sitting next to you on the front of the book." And so my dad called her right away. Her name was Tova Friedman. My dad called her right away. And she said, I keep hearing there's another survivor that was pictured with us. And anyway, long story short, these 3 were reunited, Tova Friedman, Sarah Ludwig, and my dad. And some crazy coincidences. I'm going to show you a small clip really quickly, if you don't mind, Maria. This is, so Maria mentioned I'm in the TV news business. I work for a very long time for NBC and MSNBC News. So Lester Holt he sent a crew out to cover this, and I just want to show you a little clip here.
It's one of the haunting images of the Holocaust, children freed from Auschwitz.
We are the witnesses.
This little girl, Tova Friedman, was just 6 when her mother did the unthinkable.
She hit me with a dead body, and she told me not to move.
Sarah Ludwig, just 4 in this video.
I was a very gutsy kid. I was able to survive.
Don't ask me how. This is Michael Bornstein and his grandmother.
My grandmother hid me in an quote-unquote infirmary.
He finally told his story in a book, never knowing the two girls at his side then lived just a few miles away today.
So the moment I saw the book, I said, oh, there was somebody from that picture at alive.
Hi.
This week they reunited.
Look, I've had this picture for years, and I've always wondered, where are the other people?
Oh my goodness, that's me.
Yeah, that's you.
And that's me.
72 years after they were last together.
I just want to hug you guys. Can we hug? It's such a long time.
And Tova Friedman is also featured in Honeycakes and Latkes, and she is maybe the greatest character I've ever met in my entire freaking life. That woman is amazing, and if you ask her, her recipe is the best in the book, but it's not. It's the noodle cook. So.
She has two recipes, kasha varnishkas.
Oh, you
and
gave her
tzimmes.
two. Okay, no, now I see how it goes. Shocker that she talked you into two. Oh, she's amazing. She's amazing.
We will have time for the Q&A at the end. Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, Debbie. I want us to circle back to the beginning of our friendship. I want us to go back to January 2020. As I mentioned, it was not easy for many of the survivors to go back. And I wanted Michael to ask you about the decision to go back, what it meant to you to be able to take your family to Auschwitz. And this, so the International Holocaust Remembrance Day is January 27th, and the day before, our foundation hosted a wonderful dinner in Krakow for survivors and their families. Over 500 people total, actually, that we brought with us. And it was, but I'll let you tell the story because it was a special event, and I want us to hear about your perspective on
Tell
that
them
night.
how excited you were, Dad, to go.
All I can say is Debbie is a very, very good convincer.
That's a good thing. I'm not taking that as an insult, Dad. That's fine.
She basically broke my arm to go.
He didn't want to go.
But I wasn't really interested, and she talked me into going, and I'm very glad that we did.
There's some of the people that my dad...
There were a number of people that came, and Debbie, you want to talk about some of them?
Yeah, so up there on the top is Ruth Weber. Ruth, turns out, was in the Hebrew Gymnasium with my dad when they were in Munich and living in displaced persons camps.
Also
Michael
featured in the cookbook.
Oh, she's in there too? Okay, I missed that one. And then that's Michael Zilberstein down below. And Michael came up and he said, you know, he was... he had had a stroke 5 days before the trip, and he said, my kids came to the hospital, and they said, we're so sorry, Dad, because he wanted to go. You know, really sorry you can't go. And he said, oh, I'm going. And these survivors were just, like, unbelievable, and they were like a Tower of Babel when they got there. Everybody speaking different languages. They all lived in different countries.
But Yiddish was pretty much a common language, and so we were able to understand each other.
Yeah, it was amazing. My dad and I were asked to be the keynote speakers on the eve of the anniversary of the liberation, and it was a super intimidating, for me, my dad's always cool and calm, but super intimidating event because there were more than 100 survivors there, but there were also dignitaries and ambassadors from around the world. That's what the room looked like. There were presidents from around the world were invited to attend. But only one president actually accepted the invitation, and he spoke just before us. He was incredibly gracious. He knew that we were nervous. He could see that, and he kept looking. He was seated like at a table just behind us, like right next to us, and he kept looking at us saying, you'll be okay, it's okay, you know, and afterwards he told us what a nice job we did, and that man was Ukrainian President Zalewska. Like at the time, he was already someone who people were talking about. This is 2020. It was after the impeachment hearings. But who like would have thought that this man, like I think about him still every single morning. I went back looking for the photo and my phone reel, and I was surprised, like it caught me off guard what we had signed a book for him that night. I don't know if you remember, but and it surprised me what we had written, like now in hindsight. President Zelensky, the struggle to end persecution is universal and ongoing. Never forget. And, you know, now given everything that has happened between, you know, then and now, it just strikes me, you know.
And actually, as we spoke yesterday, President Zelensky delivered his speech in Ukrainian, and we had live translators. So everybody had a like a headphone. So his speech was not written down. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, I received a couple of media requests from American media asking, "Do you have that speech?" And we didn't, but we asked somebody we knew to transcribe it, and then we translated it into English. And it was quite eerie because the whole speech was about how you truly do not know who you are until you are faced with the impossible. And as Debbie says, this sort of within the context of what happened next, it's very meaningful. Yeah. So I think that answers that question. I wanted us to end with Michael. I ask you that question quite often, and I was hoping that you could share with us if you were to. I always, we talk a lot about the legacy of the survivors who leave behind, and we talk about this moment of existential fear that we all feel, the world without any survivors left, and we talk a lot about the lessons that you want to leave behind. So I was wondering if, by the way, this was taken recently. We vacationed just 2 hotels apart from one another. But
Dominican Republic.
Yes.
Since you said your family, but what you didn't mention at the beginning is you're like the favorite daughter now. You've totally booted me. I had that locked in for so many years. And now somehow Maria's the favorite daughter.
That's a very sweet lie. I'll take it. But I wanted to ask you, Michael, to share 3 things that you know to be true, 3 things that you would want people to remember, if there were only 3 things that people would remember.
Well, one of them is optimism. I think it's really important to be optimistic. I know when we were, after the war, we were in Jarkey. I was very sick. My mother took me to Munich, Germany, and there were many kids that jumped out of windows. They didn't have any family. And optimism and looking forward to the future, I think, is important. My mother gave me later on this IWC watch, which on the back there's a Hebrew inscription, a Gimel and a Zion, and it stands for Gam Ze Ya'avor, which means this too shall pass. So one of the things that's really important is to be optimistic, look forward to the future, and this too shall pass. The other thing is education. I think the Nazis tried to get rid of the Jews, and but one thing they can't take away is education. And it's really important to get as much education as you can, and do whatever you can with it. And the third thing is to stand up against, not just against anti-Semitism. There are many Asians, many blacks, many LGBT community people who are discriminated against. And I think we all need to cut down on some of this bias and discrimination and look forward to the future. Maria, does that answer your question? Or?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Debbie, anything you want to share with us?
Just, this photo, you can think about it 2 different ways. From one survivor, there's all of this, right? 6 million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust. 6 million. 1,200 innocent Israelis were killed while going to festivals and taking Shabbat walks. Each one deserved this. 6 million Jews, every one could have had this. And one thing, we didn't talk about was my dad has gone on to, he worked for, he got his PhD in pharmaceutics and analytical chemistry, and he worked for Eli Lilly and then Johnson & Johnson. He has helped to create and is on many patents for life-changing and life-saving drugs in his lifetime. What did we miss out on? 6 million Jewish people killed. But then I also think you can look at this photo, and I do all the time at these, when we're all together, I think to my kids, from one survivor, there's all of this. And how blessed we are and how lucky we are and how grateful I am to have a dad who teaches me to always end with something positive, always think about the positive at the end of the day. Is that pretty sum up you, Dad, and your life lessons pretty well?
I think you do. And Debbie is a wonderful writer. I just
this is irrelevant to what we're talking about.
mention to you.
Wait till you start hearing about the other siblings, yeah, and the grandkids. He could be here all day. And now he adds Maria to the list. We're going to be here all day.
So we have some time for questions, if there are any questions. Yes, sir.
Before when you arrived here, so how did you survive the selection?
That's a really good question. Before coming to Auschwitz, we were in the Pionki labor camp, and before we were in a ghetto in Żarki. Actually, two of the people that lived near us in Żarki were Marvin and Eli Zborowski. They founded Yad Vashem International. And Debbie, you want to talk about some of the selection gate?
One of the things we learned in the research, so Pionki, my dad was, and his mom, and his big brother Samuel, and his grandmother Dora, his dad's mom, they were all, when Żarki was liquidated, they were all taken, as my dad said, to the Pionki labor camp, which my grandma Sophie, we had videotaped her in the 1980s, just like talking a little bit about the story. And she looks off in the distance when we asked her about Pionki, and she said, "Oh, Pionki was so nice. It was so beautiful." So looking back at that, like when I was digging everything up for my research, I was like, "Oh, Grandma lost it there." Like I really honestly just thought she was starting to lose some of her faculties, and I thought she had just sort of gotten lost in her thoughts. But actually what I learned is that Pionki was one of the best places you could possibly be during the war. It was run by a German civilian. They called him Hauptmann Brent. And he made sure that all of those prisoners were well treated. They had access to food, medical supplies, soap, toothpaste, like things we take for granted. People had babies at Pionki. People got married at Pionki. And it was all because it filtered down from the top. This was how Hauptmann Brent cared about the treatment of Jewish people. And so we learned that when Pionki was liquidated to Auschwitz, he sent word to Auschwitz. He said, "These are the best trainloads of workers in the world. Keep them alive." Obviously at 4, like you said, my dad wasn't working anywhere, but like I've always wondered whether maybe he received some extra grace because of that. All the prisoners coming in looked way healthier than other prisoners at that point in the war. They'd been well treated. But we have spoken to archivists around the world trying to get better answers to that question. And almost universally, the answer is like always the same. Like they just, shake their heads and call it a miracle. So I guess that's the best way I can answer that question.
And I can tell you what my mother said is after a while, again, I was one of the youngest kids in the bunk, the children's bunk, and the kids were taking my bread away, and my mother would sneak in. She'd get hit over the head. She showed me the scars that she had to get some of the food. Eventually, she was afraid that I would die of starvation, and so she snuck me into the women's bunk, and women went to work in the daytime, and I would basically hide under straw, according to my mother. Debbie, any other comments there?
No, that's a good summation.
Does that
yeah.
answer your question?
That's sort of the best answer we have, because the truth is, like, there's a lot of holes that we will never know for sure, but those are the pieces that we do know. Yeah.
Yes.
How did you meet up with your mother again? How did she find you?
Did everybody hear the question in the back? How did Michael reunite with his mother?
Well, my grandmother took me to Jarki after the war, and I think I mentioned that our house was occupied. We lived in a chicken coop with a board over our head in the dead of winter. My mother came back from Austria. She was sent to Austria to pack bullets because she had that skill from Pionki. And she found me again in that chicken coop, and I was pretty sick, didn't have hair on my head. You saw some of the pictures before. So she took me to Germany, and Hayas, a Jewish organization, taught her some hat-making skills. Of course, when she came to the U.S. In February '51, hats were out of vogue. But we basically came not speaking any English, not having any money, and but we managed to survive. I worked in a drugstore making 25 to 75 cents an hour. I made more than that when I retired as a director of technical operations from Johnson & Johnson. But
that pharmacist became like a mentor to my dad, so that's how we ended up going into that field.
Right.
How old were you when you came to the U.S.?
I was 11 years old, February '51.
Where did your family go? Did you stay in the East and come to L.A.?
No, we never went to L.A. We came to the Lower East Side to Delancey Street. I don't know if you've heard of Delancey Street, and Hayas put us up there. Then my uncle lived in Brooklyn, and he made a dining room available for my mother and I. We slept on a mattress there, and then we moved to New York, to Spanish Harlem. We had a one-bedroom and lived over there. So we have a little bigger place right now, but they were kind of tough beginnings, working at 25 to 75 cents an hour, delivering drugs.
Legal drugs.
Legal drugs.
Just here for quality control. So.
Any other questions?
Yes, in the back, yes.
Earlier you guys asked what kind of traumas resonate with the daughter, but what about you? What things came left over with?
What kind of trauma have you experienced? What kind of things come back to you sometimes?
Well, again, we lived in Manhattan and going through crowded subways, thinking about that cattle car ride to Auschwitz. That's one of the things, the traumas. Again, I think Debbie mentioned food. I absolutely cannot throw food away. It's not in my nature. So I have trouble, whether it's scraps of food that people would normally throw out. I kind of manage to save them and separate them to eat. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Don't mind me asking. What other things resonated with you too?
What other things resonated with you? That you still, the smells. You could talk about some of the things that you remember.
Well, again, I remember the smell, and when I think of food, it doesn't smell again like dead bodies that had in Auschwitz. But we did go through moldy potato skins to eat, and I remember Nazis shouting at me in German. So when I'd go into afterwards, when I had a few bucks, I'd go into Mercedes or BMW, and if there were people talking in German or the salespeople, I would just run out because it bothered me to, thinking about the Nazis shouting at me in German. So I hope that answers your question.
It's a really good question.
And here I just want to say one thing, because sometimes I think we take for granted the willingness and openness of survivors to speak at events like this one. And I remember, I forget, Michael, which one of our events it was, but it was also with Eugene. I think it was the Temple Emmanuel in New York, or one of those events. And after the event, I said, "Are you okay?" He said, yes, but of course I will have nightmares now for a few days. And it really struck me, because I just realized how much of the emotional labor we expect and have expected of survivors to go through, so that they bear witness and we get educated. But I think every one of those moments when we ask them to revisit those memories is harder than they gracefully make us think it is. So I want to thank you, Michael, because I know it's each one of those events takes a lot.
The fact that you're thanking my dad, and I also want to thank these kids here that are here too, because the reason my dad does this is because the reality is that, for the kids in the room, this is the last generation that will ever get to hear from a Holocaust survivor firsthand. This is it. Unless you hear from my dad, because you're going to live forever, Dad, right? But so now, my dad did stop to answer that really difficult question, the incredible, thoughtful, sensitive question you asked, and now it's your job to make sure you share that with your friends, because that's the only way these stories will be remembered. Your generation carries a really, really important responsibility. Yeah.
Sorry, there's somebody. Yeah, go ahead.
What is a tradition that your mother shared with you that you enjoy passing on to your own family?
Did you hear that, Michael?
I think food is one of the traditions that, whether it's chicken soup and matzo balls, or it's gefilte fish, or it's brisket, or it's kugel. Those are some of the important. I think most of you have had that, and they're all each a little different, but they're traditions, and those are precious, and we need to remember those moments.
And I forget who it was, but one of the survivors said to me, you cannot wear your great-grandmother's shoes or your grandmother's sweater unless she had a fabulous sense of style. But you can make the recipe she used to make, and that is the way to stay connected to our ancestors.
Okay.
In the back, somebody in the way back. Yes. Can you speak up? I'm sorry.
Why did they tattoo you? Why did they tattoo you when you went to the camp?
Well, the Nazis liked to preserve things and keep records very well. I was actually one of the last few people that were tattooed because the Nazis knew that they were losing the war, and they stopped tattooing people, and they just put them into gas chambers and burnt them. But Debbie, any comments?
Yeah, they did it. They kept careful records. These were not humans to them. There would be no reason to use their names. These were numbers. These were numbers to be, placed into jobs or placed into holes in the ground. And so just to keep track of who was where, they were numbered. So for that period, when my dad was in Auschwitz, he was not Michael. He was prisoner B1148.
Yeah, and in the beginning in Auschwitz, in the history of Auschwitz, Nazis also photographed prisoners in the beginning of the operation of the camp. Maybe some of you have seen those triptych photos, the black and white front, side. And they were also meant to provide the record, but also they were meant to be used in a case of an escape. But very quickly, Nazis realized that because of malnourishment and the physical appearance of prisoners changed so drastically that it was not an efficient and useful way of keeping the records. So, but initially that was also a way to create this archive. Yes.
How were you able to reconstruct your childhood? Because from 0 to 4, your only experience was this Holocaust, and then from 4 to 11, you had your immigration. So what like childhood things did you do to feel normal?
Did you have a childhood?
Well, I had family who recreated some of that, and that probably came from them more than anything else. And I had a childhood working in a drugstore, delivering packages, studying. My mother made me study and do my homework before I went to sleep. So education, 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 even though she wasn't really educated herself, she knew the importance of education, and she was able to talk about that. Debbie?
So you mentioned that period too, between 4 and 11, and my dad didn't really mention that at all. And some things happened in that period too that were like really awful. So I thought when I started working on Survivors Club, we knew again so much because so many of the relatives survived. Most people don't have those stories, right? But my dad did because he had someone with him at every single stage who survived. And so we had that. But so I thought initially that Survivors Club would end. The last page would be that story from the front of the book where he's liberated, and that would be how it ends, this happy ending. But then in talking to my dad, I realized like I would be doing readers such a disservice because a Holocaust survivor story and their fight to live did not end there at all. You know, my dad was homeless, he was sick, his mom took him to Germany, the last place you would expect, but there were DP camps there, right? And while he was there, a piece that we debated heavily whether to include in the book, my dad was assaulted. He was picked up. So his mom, my grandma Sophie, was struggling to make ends meet, and so she was doing work on the black market. At night, she would get things from American soldiers and sailors, like nylons and chocolate, and she would sell them on the black market at night, and she would be out very late. And my dad would stay up all night, worried would he lose his mother. And so as often as he could, he would go stay with some of the uncles and aunts were also in DP camps at this point. She would send him, he would hitchhike to go to where they were. And so he got into the wrong car with a man who, you know, had ill intent. And it wasn't something I knew till my dad and I started talking. And we thought like, long and hard about whether to include this. The Survivors Club was written for middle grade readers. And my mom actually, if you remember, Mom had a hard time with it. Mom said, Michael, don't tell her that. Don't talk about that, you know. And I'm very proud of my dad that he said, no, I remember this very vividly. And he wanted to include some of this in his book. And I'm so proud of my dad. I'm so proud of my dad because he's connected with a lot of people who have suffered over the years, a lot of kids who have reached out to him. And it is a part of his story. It is a part of his survival. And so I appreciate your question because there's a lot that happened in there that he remembers that, you know, maybe it's harder for him to talk about in this kind of a venue, but he allowed me to include in his story, so.
I think,
Yes,
Jenna.
go ahead. Do you have another question?
Yeah. So where exactly were you from the ages of 4 to 11? You were still in Europe, evidently, because you didn't come to New York till you were 11.
Yes.
So where were you in Europe and what were you doing?
From Jarkey, we went to Munich, Germany, and we lived in a one-bedroom. There was a landlady who was kind of wicked, but then she saw what we were going through. She had a swastika charm on her as a necklace, and that, you know, I still remember that. So we lived in Munich for about 5 years. My mother worked at Hayas and learned to be a hat maker, and again, hats were out of vogue when we came to the U.S. Yes, the kids were terrible. They were mocking me. I didn't have hair. I didn't have the right clothes. My mother put me into Gymnasia Ivrit Germania, Hebrew Gymnasium of Germany, and we can only speak Yiddish and Hebrew at that gymnasium. So this is where we learned Hebrew and Yiddish, and I speak Yiddish. Yiddish is my mama lashon, if some of you know what that is. So my mother didn't speak much English, but I spoke Yiddish to her regularly.
When you came to New York, you didn't speak any English?
No, I didn't speak any English. We didn't have any money, and as I said, Hayes put us up in the Lower East Side on Delancey Street. All right. Who else?
One last,
Anyone
Jenna,
else?
yes.
You want to leave it for one
One
more?
last question, yeah, right there. How did you get reunited with all of your, not siblings,
His aunts and uncles.
aunts and uncles? Yes.
His brother died.
His brother died.
Yeah, my brother and my father went to the men's or the adult side of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and my mother had a chance to work near the gate where the men's side was, and at the end of the day she found out that they were murdered, gassed, and slaughtered in Auschwitz.
The aunts and uncles, though, returned to Zharki. My grandma Sophie's aunts and uncles, and actually one of the last sisters, aunts, to come back. She was in a carriage getting on the last leg of the trip back to Zharki, and she told the carriage driver that, you know, she was going to find her family, and he said, "I'm so sorry, nobody's left. There's no Jews left in Zharki." He said the only family that made it was the Jonish family, which is my grandma Sophie Jonish, and she was like, "That's my family." But they were all reunited. Ultimately, everybody came to New York, and then Florida, but everybody was, you know, very close. And it's incredible to me how they recreate, like they just started over from nothing. I mean, some of us are upset if it's a bad stock day or whatever, right? Like, I lost this. They had nothing, and they just rebuilt their lives. Created leather factory, created a corset, business in New York City. That was one of the aunts. Like, they just didn't look back, and they recreated their lives. It's a lesson, like, I want my kids to see and learn too from Survivors Club. It is not just a story of like despair and death, and it is a story of resilience. And I want my kids to see that's in their DNA, and it's in the Jewish DNA. It is. I believe that.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Jen.
And Michael and Debbie, what an inspiring duo you are. So thank you both so much for being here.